Before I begin, I want to thank, first of all, Warren for the lovely introduction, particularly the anecdote about the dive bar on the east side. And I want to thank the Center for Southeast Asian Studies for this kind invitation. I'm particularly grateful to you all for coming out, since this is my maiden presentation of a book manuscript titled Cold War on Five Continents that is now just a first draft, rendering my presentation rather raw. In this talk, I will start with my process, move to my analytical tools, and then come to some actual cases, showing the way that the model illuminates the Cold War's history. So let's begin with process. These days, if you listen to NPR, every creator, whether actor, director, composer, or performer, likes to talk about their process. And though we rarely talk about it, historians do have a creative process, so let's begin with process. To write this book, it has taken me a long time to know what I know. About 50 years ago, at the height of the Cold War, I took a semester off from the Yale Graduate School, where I was doing a PhD in Southeast Asian history, to travel around the world researching CIA operations and interviewing 4 of the era's most famous covert operatives. Now, at the time, writing that first book, I mined those interviews for the bare facts of time, person, and place needed to frame a narrative for that first book of mine, The Politics of Heroin. And once that book was published in August of 1972, I put those encounters behind me and moved on to other topics like the Philippines. But then about 4 years ago, when I started writing lectures in a mad rush, 750 pages of lectures in 6 months, for an undergraduate history course on the Cold War here at UW, those long ago interviews kept intruding, not as mere facts, but as a dazzling kaleidoscope of unsettling recollections. Traveling some 30,000 miles across 3 continents back in 1971, myriad sensations so bombarded my brain that my internalization, my conscious comprehension at the age of just 26 was overwhelmed, unable to grasp but a fragment of those stimuli. In these travels, my main interlocutors were domineering, even ruthless, French and American covert operatives, whom I did not merely meet, but who collided with my consciousness in ways that my mind, overcharged by fear, fascination, or maybe both, could not fully comprehend at the time. In the years that followed, some recess of memory was unwittingly storing and processing those sounds and sights into insights that now surface very quickly, pushing aside the mere facts of time, person, and place to somehow spark the core ideas that emerge almost fully formed to inform this book. Now, at the same time that I was traveling the world, one of the seeds for the ideas that grew into this book was planted when, as a graduate student at Yale, I read a proof copy of Professor Jonathan Spence's brilliant book titled To Change China. And in that book, I was introduced to Chinese Gordon, a British mercenary commander in China's turmoil of the 1860s, whose career has parallels, it turned out, with the Cold War's covert operatives that I'll be discussing in this talk. While also at Yale, I had the good fortune to study with the Oxford imperial historian, David K. Fieldhouse, who led me to more of those legendary British adventurers whom historians now call the man on the spot, famous for expanding the frontiers of that great global empire. More broadly, the writing of this book about the global Cold War has been a voyage of discovery, taking me far from my professional specialization in Southeast Asia to countries and indeed whole continents beyond my ken. Yet without that half-century of immersion in the history of Southeast Asia, this global voyage of discovery would not have been possible. I would argue that no other world region experienced quite so forcefully the full range of the Cold War's militarized violence, national revolution, communist revolt, army coups, aerial bombardment, conventional combat, covert intervention, warlord armies, systematic torture, and psychological warfare. Studying each of these forms of war in a Southeast Asian context over the years served to stock a kind of analytical toolkit that has proved useful, even essential, in this global voyage. As one of the earliest arenas for the Cold War's conflicts, Southeast Asia also produced an extraordinary cadre of covert operatives, several of whom I interviewed for that earlier research project. And in the course of that work long ago, I noted and wondered about the simultaneous experience in the early 1950s of American, British, Dutch, and French counterinsurgency officers who seemed surprisingly influential in shaping the history of several Southeast Asian nations. But then I self-corrected and set that observation aside, thinking it a mere coincidence. But now, placing those four famous covert operatives in a global context for this Cold War book led me to the realization that they were latter-day men on the spot, who seemed in the global import of their actions strikingly similar to early British men on the spot, early British imperial agents like Chinese Gordon. Once I began looking for the man on the spot in each of the far-flung crises that marked the Cold War, they kept popping up assertively from the documents scattered across my desktop until I discovered about 30 of them, each one playing a significant role in the hotspots on 5 continents. Next, my analytical tools. To compress 50 years of Cold War history spanning 5 continents between 2 covers requires some tools, a model, if you like, to accomplish that magic trick, that artifice. While the British men on the spot operated within a simple binary of the empire's expansion or non-expansion, their Cold War counterparts gained an autonomy for action through the interaction among 3 key factors. First factor, geopolitics. To follow the Cold War's sweep across the globe, we need, or I needed, to don the 7-league boots of geopolitical analysis, to leap from continent to continent, country to country, using this concept to explore the dynamics driving a relentless succession of local wars that, by historical addition, killed about 20 million people, the second most bloody conflict in the modern era after World War II. At the high tide of the British Empire in 1904, this man, English geographer Sir Alfred Mackinder, published an influential article that launched the modern study of geopolitics by merging, here's his map for that article, by merging the continents of Europe, Asia, and Africa into a tricontinental world island, and then arguing that its heartland in Eurasia was the epicenter of global power. And here's the tricontinental world island, and the pivot area, or the heartland, is the epicenter of world power. At the end of World War I, Mackinder summarized those insights in a memorable maxim: who rules the heartland commands the world island. Who rules the world island commands the world. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, President Jimmy Carter's former national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, shown there, applied Mackinder's theory to explain the Cold War, saying, and I quote, "Geopolitically, the struggle was for control over the Eurasian landmass. Each side understood that the successful ejection of the one from the western and eastern fringes of Eurasia would ultimately determine the geostrategic outcome of the contest." And by the way, you notice in this file, he's got something there that says salt. That is not a condiment for a White House lunch, by the way. Amidst this strategic armamentation, amidst this constant geopolitical struggle that marked the Cold War, a void, an absence of imperial control, sometimes opened momentarily on one of these continents, creating an opportunity for a mere human, a man on the spot, to somehow steer the direction of these overwhelming geopolitical forces and literally make history happen. Second factor of my 3, covert operations. The Cold War was, as we look back, a veritable golden age of espionage. In a world where an overt military clash between Moscow and Washington risked the destruction of the planet through thermonuclear war, the major powers found it safer to compete obliquely, indirectly, through espionage and surrogate warfare, thereby investing their secret services with extraordinary authority and giving their covert operatives exceptional autonomy. For the first time in world history, the Cold War made covert agencies key instruments of statecraft, compelling every major power to either establish or expand its covert operations, its secret services, including Washington's CIA, Moscow's KGB, Britain's MI6, or the French SDECE. Final factor among my 3, decolonization. The coincidence between the Cold War and the decolonization of Europe's colonial empires is one of the most consequential and least understood aspects of the global conflict called Cold War. Instead of ending in the 1970s, as some scholars have indeed argued, decolonization, in fact, continued from 1946 all the way to 1994, meaning there's a precise coincidence with the Cold War, which is 1947 to 1991. As anti-colonial struggles swept across the globe throughout the Cold War, decolonization acted like a storm front, producing periodic maelstroms in Asia, Africa, and Latin America that opened geopolitical ruptures, veritable voids in the world order that allowed otherwise obscure covert operatives the autonomy to become a man on the spot. So, just as colonization created opportunities for British imperial men on the spot, so decolonization allowed the emergence of their Cold War counterparts. Let's turn now to consider the man on the spot very briefly, sort of in the abstract. Although there were many differences between them, both the British Empire and the Cold War were influenced by individual actors called the man on the spot. Now, despite Victorian England's formal policy of non-expansion, the British Empire somehow expanded relentlessly to cover a quarter of the Earth's surface, largely through the initiative of individuals whom British historians have now called the man on the spot. In 1839, this man, James Brooke, sailed his yacht into Kuching harbor on the north coast of Borneo and soon became the White Raja of Sarawak, forming a British colony that survived for nearly a century. By leading mercenaries against Messianic rebels near Shanghai in the 1860s, Charles Chinese Gordon won renown and later met an heroic death as Gordon of Khartoum that inspired the British conquest of Sudan. In Central Africa, the Diamond King Cecil Rhodes dispatched 700 mercenaries with 5 Maxim machine guns that cut down thousands of Matabele fighters, subduing a vast territory he dubbed modestly Rhodesia, which is now Zambia and Zimbabwe. As British influence expanded across the Middle East during World War I, a junior officer in the British Army named T.E. Lawrence led an Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire and later, along with a woman on the spot, Gertrude Bell, helped his comrade in arms, Prince Faisal, become the first ruler of a British client state, the King of Iraq. And this is Lawrence here, and this is Prince Faisal al-Hashimi. During the Cold War's frequent crises, 24 of these latter-day men on the spot turned up in cities scattered across 5 continents. In Athens, Jakarta, Manila, Saigon, Vientiane, Tehran, Kinshasa, Rwanda, Paris, and even Washington, D.C. By their numbers, diversity, and even essence, these men are not, I repeat, are not Hegel's world historical individuals of the stature of Julius Caesar and Napoleon Bonaparte. Now, as a young man in 1806, as shown in this etching, the young philosopher, Friedrich Hegel, went out for an evening walk and he saw Napoleon Bonaparte riding out by himself for a reconnaissance on the eve of the Battle of Jena against the Prussian army. And Hegel called him a world soul on horseback who reaches out over the world and masters it. 20 years later, in his philosophy of history, an aging Hegel argued that these world historical figures are, quote, agents of a step in the progress of the universal spirit toward freedom. Finding the kernel of historical change ready to burst forth from its shell, they released it just as Julius Caesar not only served himself by his many conquests, but, Hegel said, quote, at the same time fulfilled the necessary historical destiny of Rome and the world. But instead of so shaping history's grand design, our much more modest men on the spot kind of maneuver at its margins, exploiting imperial transitions to kind of nudge a nation in their desired direction, which, by the way, is rarely, if ever at all, progress towards Hegel's greater good. While they do not shape history, they are shaped by it. When infused with the power of a rising hegemonic empire, they are capable, though still inconsequential individuals, of consequential action that expands their empire's ambit. If, by contrast, their empire is receding, their efforts, no matter how skilled or resolute, cannot stem that ebbing tide. How exactly this geopolitical shift is transmuted into these individuals remains for me elusive, but the contrast between their success and failure becomes clear at times when multiple men on the spot are active in the same world arena, such as Southeast Asia in the early 1950s. Lacking anything akin to the grandeur of Julius Caesar, Napoleon Bonaparte, or even Henry Kissinger, our men on the spot live lives marked by ordinariness, even obscurity, yet they still have that fleeting moment at the epicenter of historical change. Now, if we weave their biographical threads into an historical tapestry known as prosopography or collective biography, among the 30 men on the spot active in the Cold War, 19 were born between 1908 and 1927, and almost all of those fought in World War II, thus forming a distinct generation that emerged battle-hardened for the extraordinary demands of a covert career. And so we start here with Lansdale, we go all the way down to Pham Xuan An. That's our cohort, that's our cohort of World War II veterans. Reflecting the global reach of U.S. hegemony, as well as the bureaucratic style of Soviet espionage that precluded individual initiative, 18 of these 30 operatives were Americans. Another 4 were French, 4 British, and 4 from more diverse backgrounds, Chilean, Cuban, Dutch, and Vietnamese. Once scholars start looking, they're likely to find dozens more of these once invisible historical actors. During the Cold War's first decades, the CIA's version of these men on the spot produced a succession of seemingly stunning clandestine victories that created a pantheon of putative American heroes. In 1953, presidential grandson Kermit Roosevelt conducted a daring coup that secured Iran's oil industry for the West. As the French retreated from Indochina in 1954, Edward Lansdale, shown here doffing his cap behind President Rhodesia, preempted a communist takeover of South Vietnam by installing Diem as a pro-American leader in Saigon. A decade later, Lansdale's CIA comrade, Lucien Conin, shown there, here he is in the background, and there's the coup group, and Pham Xuan An, his main instrument in that coup, conducted or fomented a coup which killed that same president, Ngo Dinh Diem, inadvertently plunging South Vietnam into sustained political crisis that precipitated U.S. intervention in what became the Vietnam War. On another continent, CIA chief in Kinshasa, Congo, Larry Devlin, formed a pliable if kleptocratic regime out of the chaos in post-colonial Congo and installed General Mobutu in power for the next 30 years. While American agents infused with the peerless power of U.S. global hegemony were the most successful, they were by no means alone in this shadowy interstice of international politics. Only a month after Indonesia won independence from the Netherlands in 1949, this man, Raymond the Turk Westerling, shown here at the head of his DST commandos and marching down the streets of Jakarta at the height of the Dutch return in 1947, he plotted a coup that planned to slaughter the cabinet of Muhammad Hatta, Indonesia's new prime minister, and bring Indonesia back within Amsterdam's ambit. As France fought to hold its Indochina colony in the early 1950s, this man, Major Roger Tranquier, commanded an army of 20,000 tribal guerrillas before moving on to Algeria, where he developed a doctrine of tactical torture that killed 3,000 insurgents and later inspired the CIA's Phoenix program of torture and extrajudicial executions in Vietnam. And by the way, look into those eyes. I sat opposite him for 3 hours in Paris in 1971, and I emerged from that interview almost stumbling out of his apartment, psychologically drained, and teaching me the extraordinary power of these men on the spot that carried them to such heights or depths of personal achievement. In Francophone Africa, paramilitary operatives Bob Denard, shown there on the right with Mobutu, and Roger Tranquier himself, led white mercenaries in covert operations to preserve the penumbra of French power, just as the CIA used the British mercenary shown here, Mad Mike Horde, to drive Soviet-armed guerrillas out of eastern Congo in 1965, 1966. During the 1970s and 1980s, the Cuban revolutionary, Jorge Vizquez, shown there on the left in the beret, coordinated Cuban and Soviet support for Angola's Marxist government, fighting and defeating a formidable tandem of CIA cash and South African firepower, thereby helped free Namibia from colonial rule and end apartheid in South Africa. Let's now get to some historical cases. Let's turn, in fact, to a few cases from Southeast Asia to see how these men on the spot actually influenced the course of the Cold War, starting in Saigon in 1954-55. Now, while the Geneva Conference of 1954 that ended the French Indochina War was creating conditions that would likely lead to a communist control, a communist-dominated unitary Vietnamese state, the CIA director of the day, Allen Dulles, tried to avoid this outcome by sending his covert operative, Edward Lansdale, to Saigon undercover as an assistant Air Force attaché. Instead of detailed instructions, Allen's brother, who was the Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, told Lansdale simply, quote, "I want you to do what you did in the Philippines." That's another story. A brief so broad that Lansdale had ample autonomy to become Washington's man on the spot in Saigon. Adding to his autonomy, and this is interesting, the 1954 Geneva Agreement created a 2-year hiatus in the sovereignty of the Vietnamese state. Okay, it was suspended sovereignty until a plebiscite in 1956 would establish a unitary government. So that, in effect, made Vietnam kind of a momentary void in the world order, an interstice where an individual man on the spot could influence the course of history. Landing at Saigon in May of 1954, knowing, as he put it, nothing about Northern Diem or Vietnam for that matter, Lansdale quickly decided Diem was the ideal anti-communist ally. And there's Diem right here. This is Lansdale, and this, by the way, for those who are interested, Johnny Orendine, well-known Filipino journalist who also wrote the Constitution for the new Republic of Vietnam, part of the Lansdale team that he brought in from the Philippines. Anyway, Lansdale, as I said, quickly decided that Diem was an ideal anti-communist ally. And to reinforce Diem's rule, which was very shaky in 1954-55, Lansdale, though still a lowly lieutenant colonel in the Air Force, would have to defeat a formidable array of opponents, including a French military determined to preserve its post-colonial influence, a pro-French crime syndicate called the Pham Xuan An Bandits that ruled Saigon and its underworld, a local U.S. mission dubious about Diem, and above all, senior officials in Washington, D.C., who had real doubts about Diem's capacity for leadership. By March of 1955, however, Lansdale's covert manipulations and Diem's parallel efforts had won over Vietnam's army and most of the religious sect militias in the Mekong Delta, leaving the French with just one reliable ally. The Pham Xuan An Bandits, whose 9,000 armed men controlled Saigon's opium dens, gambling casinos, the world's largest brothel, rendering them immune to the CIA's fiscal pressures. Adding to their power, the Pham Xuan's deputy commander served simultaneously as the chief of Vietnam's national police, a position they secured by paying the head of the state, Emperor Bao Dai, $1 million bribe. By then, however, President Eisenhower's special emissary, that man there on the left with Diem, Lieutenant General, note the rank, Lieutenant General, not just a brigadier, not just a major, but a Lieutenant General, which is getting very, very high. Lieutenant General J. Lawton Collins had, after 5 months in Vietnam, decided that Diem was utterly unfit for office, unfit, unable to resolve tensions with the Pham Xuan and the armed sects. In early April of 1955, General Collins cabled Washington recommending that the Emperor Bao Dai should replace Diem, who was, he said, unfit for leadership, a suggestion that won the support of President Eisenhower, who called General Collins home to Washington, D.C. for consultations. Back home in Washington, D.C., General Collins excoriated Diem's leadership, saying he had, quote, demonstrated such a marked inability to understand the political, economic, and military problems associated with Vietnam, criticism that caused Secretary of State John Foster Dulles on April 27 to cable U.S. officials in Paris and Saigon, saying, make plans for replacing Ziem. In other words, Ziem was out. He was done. Within hours, however, Ziem, with Lansdale at his side, ordered the Vietnamese army to drive the Pham Xuan bandits out of Saigon, sparking 5 days of very destructive house-to-house combat in Saigon. In the end, the bandits were routed, Ziem became master of the city, and Secretary Dulles cabled the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, hailing Ziem as, quote, a popular hero, and, quote, a symbol of Vietnamese nationalism, whose removal, quote, would be highly detrimental to our prestige in Asia. Against almost overwhelming odds, Lansdale had outmaneuvered his many enemies, the French, the Pham Xuan bandits, General Collins, and the State Department, to make his hand-picked protege Washington's new surrogate leader in South Vietnam. That victory made Edward Lansdale the most famous CIA operative of the Cold War, whose clandestine intrigues were celebrated in 3 feature films. The Quiet American in 1958, starring Audie Murphy. Okay, quick quiz here. Who's heard of Audie Murphy?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, all right. And the rest of you, I won't ask for the hands of shame. The greatest American fighting man of World War II, so-called, okay? Okay, and he had a career as a B action star. This was his big role playing answer. And here's another one, Marlon Brando, and probably his worst movie ever, and there's a lot of competition for that role. Anyway, The Ugly American, playing the Lansdale figure, and then the remake with Michael Caine and Brendan Fraser, before Wade, playing the Lansdale figure. Simultaneously, however, another of General Lansdale's less visible proteges, recruited and promoted with the same empowered hubris, would later become Hanoi's top spy in Saigon and do incalculable damage to the later U.S. war effort in South Vietnam. Let's now turn to that case, South Vietnam during the Vietnam War. Now, viewed broadly, in my perspective, the Vietnam War from 1962 to 1975 was divided into 2 key domains. Conventional infantry combat, which the United States won. We won every battle, never lost, okay? And the CIA's counter-terror campaign, which suffered a sub-rosa defeat, becoming, I would argue, the key reason the United States lost the Vietnam War, although nobody except myself ever seems to say this, but yeah, hear me out, folks. Simply put, Hanoi's efficient counterintelligence, which penetrated South Vietnam's military from top to bottom, from left to right, inside and outside, defeated the CIA's attempt at uprooting the Viet Cong communist underground through the CIA's massive counter-terror apparatus called the Phoenix Program that was responsible for 41,000 extrajudicial executions. Now, if you want to get an idea about what that is, imagine the wall in the Vietnam Memorial, that's 58,000 names. So 41,000, that's a lot of bodies, okay? In a 1969 study of the enemy counterintelligence, the CIA found that the Communist Viet Cong had infiltrated 30,000 Communist spies in every facet of Saigon security services, making this what the CIA called, quote, by far the biggest agent network in the history of espionage. Now, I discovered the sophistication, I came to this insight about communist counterintelligence through the accident of 2 personal connections. Now, as a sophomore at a small New England boarding school in the early 1960s, I was on the wrestling team with a senior named John Merson, who later dropped out of college and wound up in Vietnam as a Marine Corps Lance Corporal, leading a squad in village pacification efforts. In his memoir, here's the memoir, War Lessons, that's Merson right there on the cover. In the memoir, Merson recalled that his unit, quote, received a report of Viet Cong traveling downriver in our direction. So, shortly after midnight, Merson's Marines, quote, fired automatic rifles, machine guns, and grenade launchers, creating a killing zone that slaughtered all 20 people in the boats coming down that river. Here's the actual text of the passage. Now, although that intelligence was strikingly accurate about the time and place, it was off by just one small detail. The people in the boats were not Viet Cong troops. They were, as Merson wrote, unarmed women, children, and old men. Okay? In shock and revulsion, what they had done. Merson and his Marines waited out the rest of the war, hiding in villages, avoiding any kind of combat until their time came up and they could go home. Now, before Merson published that book back in 2008, he heard somehow I was teaching here on the Vietnam War, and he sent me the manuscript for review. And I got it around November, I think, around Thanksgiving time. And so at Christmas, we were vacation with my mother and my stepfather. My stepfather was a retired U.S. Marine colonel who had served as Deputy Chief of Intelligence at the U.S. military headquarters in Saigon as his last assignment before retiring. Now, I told my stepfather, Kruger, the story about how a schoolmate of mine had been responsible for the massacre of 20 women and children. And bam, like that. I mean, faster than you can imagine. As soon as I finished the story, my stepfather shot back at me and said, "Good counterintelligence by the enemy." I said, "What? What do you mean?" He said, think about it. Okay, upriver, those villagers hate the Americans. And that Marine squad, good squad. The Viet Cong could never knock those guys out of the war by themselves. So it's a win-win for the enemy. Good counterintelligence by the enemy. In effect, communist counterintelligence, like all good counterintelligence, had flipped the Phoenix program, making it a killing machine that turned people against the Saigon government. And before I go on, nothing I should say should be construed as a criticism of John Merson, who has done decades of charity work with children in Vietnam. And here he is in an American charity called Children's Vietnam. He's built, I think, 4 or 5 orphanages. He goes to Vietnam every year for several months. He helps in development of real estate projects. He's now a couple years older than I am. He's in his 80s. He's still doing this, still sort of dealing with what happened to him. Now, some of those 30,000 spies proved to be extraordinarily skilled operatives, particularly a Time magazine reporter named Pham Xuan An, who was Hanoi's man on the spot in Saigon and provided North Vietnam with intelligence critical for almost all of its major military victories during the Vietnam War. And here's a photograph of Pham Xuan An with his military issued press card. After induction to the Communist Party in 1953, Pham Xuan An infiltrated ARVN headquarters in 1955, where he met CIA operative Edward Lansdale, who taught him intelligence tradecraft and sent him to college in California on a CIA scholarship, where he gained insight into the American mindset that he later used to analyze documents purloined for his communist superiors in Hanoi. Hanoi's first major victory in the Vietnam War came in January 1963, when 1,400 Saigon soldiers, backed by 15 U.S. Army helicopters and 13 armored vehicles, attacked the village of Ap Bac in the Mekong Delta, but instead of an easy victory, suffered 200 casualties, and 5 of the helicopters were shot down. An American pilot was killed when they were ambushed by a small force of Viet Cong guerrillas who had been warned of the attack by Hanoi's master spy, Pham Xuan An. Through his contacts with South Vietnam officials, an American journalist like New Yorker reporter Robert Chaplin, who was very close to the CIA station in Saigon, Pham Xuan An compiled 498 typed up intelligence reports sent to Hanoi that were critical for most of Hanoi's major victories, including the Battle of Ap Bac, 1963, the U.S. invasion of Cambodia, 1970, the ARVN invasion of Laos in 1971, the campaign for Saigon's capture in 1975, and above all, the 1968 Tet Offensive. And by the way, this is a very famous series of photographs by the renowned photographer, Richard Avedon. This was part of an exhibit at the Metropolitan Museum of Art when the photograph was about the size of that wall. Okay? And that's Pham Xuan An whispering into the ear of the famous journalist Robert Chaplin, who was generally regarded as the best informed correspondent about intelligence during the Vietnam War. There was some controversy about Chaplin and his relationship with the CIA. And in his defense, he said, "I didn't work for the CIA, they worked for me." For 2 years prior to the communist devastating 1968 Tet Offensive, Pham Xuan An escorted the head of communist intelligence for South Vietnam, pistol-packing major named Thu Cong, around Saigon to select 20 targets for this surprise attack, including the psychologically devastating attack on the grounds of the U.S. Embassy. 2 years later, when U.S. troops started withdrawing from South Vietnam, President Nixon decided to buy Saigon's army some breathing room by attacking the North Vietnamese sanctuaries inside Cambodia in 1970 and sending Saigon's army into southern Laos to cut the Ho Chi Minh supply trail in 1971. Both invasions were compromised by Pham Xuan An, whose timely intelligence allowed the North Vietnamese army to evacuate the Cambodian sanctuaries. So we forayed in there with our tanks, and they had just stepped back. They knew exactly how far we were going to go. They stepped back a couple miles beyond the limit of the U.S. advance, and they lost a lot of rice. They did lose a lot of rice. They couldn't move the rice. But aside from that, the offensive was a failure. The Laos invasion by the South Vietnamese army became a death trap for Saigon soldiers because the North Vietnamese had ample time to prepare ambushes. In March of 1975, Hanoi launched a tank attack on Bang Me Thuot city in the central highlands of Vietnam, which Pham Xuan An's intelligence identified as being particularly vulnerable, precipitating a sudden South Vietnamese retreat from the northern half of South Vietnam and the very hasty fall of Saigon. After he resigned as Saigon bureau chief for time in 1976, Hanoi awarded Pham Xuan An the rank of general and gave him 16 medals, one for each of his major contributions to Vietnam's victory. And there is General Pham Xuan An in the uniform of People's Army of Vietnam general. Case number 3, Jakarta. Recently declassified records reveal that in 1965-66, Britain conducted psychological warfare or psy-war operations that may well have changed, or may well have sparked the massacre of Indonesia's Communist Party, known as the PKI, changing Indonesia's international alignment from neutralism or pro-Beijing into an anti-communist bastion of the Western Alliance. As arguably the West's greatest victory in the entire Cold War, these events challenge us to explain how psy-war could so inflame indigenous political passions for such a sustained slaughter. Exploration of this problem leads us to an obscure Foreign Office official, this man, Sir Norman Redaway, shown there on the right, and it also reveals the work of a clandestine British psy-war unit, the Information Research Department, or IRD, that played a critical yet unrecognized role in the Cold War. Indonesia's move from Beijing's orbit to the U.S. sphere was such a profoundly consequential blow to the world order that it created a geopolitical opening for the appearance of a man on the spot in the person of Norman Redaway. Now, after an abortive communist coup that killed 6 top Indonesian generals and sparked a military counter-coup in October of 1965, the British and American embassies in Jakarta seized on the political instability as an opportunity to oust this man, President Sukarno of Indonesia, and replace him with the leader of the counter-coup, General Suharto. And, that's an amazing photograph because you notice how he's got his finger up there, and you notice those thousands of pairs of eyes. They're all focused on that finger. He had that extraordinary ability of the great orator to take his audience, put them in the hand, carry them through the course of his narrative, put them right down where he wanted them at the end of his speech. He was truly an amazing figure. Now, in October 1965, the IRD, the Information Research Department psy-war expert Norman Redaway, he was, by the way, one of the co-founders of this unit in 1946-47. He arrived in Singapore with a broad authority as the coordinator of political warfare to become London's man on the spot in Southeast Asia. And we have a chart that shows, if you will, the centrality and the power. And this is Redaway's. Redaway was the coordinator of information. This is him here. And so what we have is the Malaysian government, Britain, Australia, New Zealand, the Information Research Department. Okay, all of these units are putting information into the coordinator, and he is sending it out. Okay, covert press outlets, Hong Kong, London outlets, correspondents in Singapore, world news media, and then Indonesian targets. This is the structure of his information. Now, let's turn to Redaway to explain what this chart means. As Redaway later explained, his Cyborg campaign had two key elements, and I quote, "The news machine was our bludgeon. The newsletter, an Indonesian language newsletter that they publish, and our unorthodox operations are stiletto. The bludgeon was surprisingly effective because we were able to supply publicists with information which they could not find from other sources because of Sukarno's censorship." Now, with the stiletto inserting volatile black propaganda in Indonesia, and the bludgeon influencing, indeed shaping international coverage of the country, Redaway had formed an informational synergy of almost unprecedented power. Now, illustrating just how sharp that stiletto could be, right after the October 1965 communist coup, IRD and their Indonesian military allies began circulating propaganda that proved particularly inflammatory in this patriarchal Muslim nation, claiming that the communist women's group, the Gerwani, had danced naked before a bonfire, cut off the genitalia of the generals, and then waving the severed members, threw themselves into the crowd of communist cadre for a manic orgy of blood and semen. And at the National Monument in Lubang Buaya, the Crocodile Pit, this is a massive marbled monument with dioramas, et cetera, commemorating these events. The Gerwani women are portrayed. You can see them down here, the dancers. And let's get to a close-up that I think is revealing. Okay, it's the hip on that woman. Okay, is exaggerated. Japanese and Balinese are famous as having the least articulated gender dimorphism. What is gender dimorphism? The difference between the skeletal structure of male and female. The most extreme are 11th century Celts. Guys are like this, women are like that. Okay? Balinese are boop, Javanese are boop, straight up and down. Okay? So that hip is articulating the idea of the Gerwani as being large hip, large busts. You know. For his cyborg bludgeon, Redaway planted news stories in the mainstream media critical of the Communist Party, President Sukarno, and his foreign minister, Subandrio. For 6 critical months, October 1965 to March 1966, Redaway dominated international coverage of Indonesia, allowing him to attempt regime change through disinformation alone. Rather than cultivate individual correspondence, Redaway preferred radio networks such as the BBC and wire services like the Associated Press, AP, and Reuters, which, Redaway said, were, quote, omnivores all round the clock. By December 1965, IRD was soon filling the international press with at least one slanted news story every single day, including, for example, an Associated Press dispatch saying the army had captured 600 communist diaries detailing plans for a communist terror campaign following the murder of the 6 generals. In firing off this burst of dispatches, Redaway did not lose sight of his main quarry, Foreign Minister Subandrio and his patron, President Sukarno. After 4 months of Redaway's disinformation, there was a de facto regime change in Jakarta in March of 1966 involving Foreign Minister Subandrio's arrest, Sukarno's de facto demotion to caretaker president, and above all, General Suharto's sweeping martial law authority. While the stiletto may have sharpened the attack on the Communist Party inside Indonesia, the bludgeon clearly controlled international press coverage long enough to keep the world at bay so the army could complete its slaughter of 1 million members of the Indonesian Communist Party unstopped, undisturbed. Years later, after his career ended with his appointment as British ambassador to Poland, Redaway said, and I quote, "We got rid of Sukarno probably 2 or 3 years earlier than he would have gone anyway, in 1965-66, by getting extremely good information about what was going on in Indonesia and getting it into the right hands in the press." Let's now sum things up. Following these men on the spot into their clandestine shadowlands reminds us that empire, and the clash of empires that was the Cold War, was and is a dirty business. Watching General Pinochet's men on the spot, the American assassin Michael Vernon Townley, shown here, murder some of Chile's finest leaders, Then witnessing Colonel James Steele, that's the execution of Orlando Tellier, the bombing in Washington, D.C. in September 1976. And then witnessing Colonel James Steele, the U.S. man on the spot in San Salvador, preside over death squads in El Salvador in the 1980s and Iraq after 2004, reveals that the dash and drama of espionage that dances daily across our television screens is largely a fiction, a cinematic fabrication. Indeed, the Cold War's covert interventions, which these men embodied, relied on some of the cruelest instruments in the toolkit of modern statecraft: assassination, psychological manipulation, mass murder, torture, terror, and surrogate warfare. So it was for the old Cold War, and so it yet may be for the new Cold War that is now following in its wake. Thank you.